Hi. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this online event. It's a very special one, hosted at IDS with some incredibly important guests. And we're here to launch and discuss a book that's just come out called Ending Global Poverty. And the subtitle is Four Women's Noble Conspiracy. And the four women in the title are Eveline Herfkens from the Netherlands, Hilde Johnson from Norway, Clare from the UK, and Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zeul from Germany. And these four women all became ministers in charge of their government's development cooperation policies for a key period between 1997 and 98 and on into the 2000s. And they were all passionate in their commitment, not just to ending global poverty, but actually to doing something about it and implementing it. Really representing, I think, what we can look back on as a golden era for development cooperation and its poverty focus. They became known as the Utstein-four, apparently, after the place where they formalized their collaboration. And in doing so, I think, made development history, but in a way that also has some incredibly important lessons for today. Costas Nicolaou has just produced a book in collaboration with these four women, which tells the story and looks at some of its implications. And Oxford University Press have just published this, and here we are to launch it. I must say, having looked at it over the last few days, it's a great book. It's a tale of women's empowerment. It's a story about the power of leadership and of collaboration. Just the kind of leadership we need to address the complex challenges we're facing today. And I think it's a story of hope, which is something we badly need in our crisis-ridden world. And I hope a story of inspiration to our current and future generations. So I'm delighted today that we've got with us both the author and two of the four women. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then they'll each be speaking. So Costas Nicolaou is an eminent development economist. He's written about economic development and poverty eradication for more than half a century. He's held key positions in the World Bank, in USAID, and a number of other organizations, and he's also taught economics at several universities. He's the author of several very important books, including most recently Emerging Powers in the WTO, amongst others. And he has been the lead author in the book. He'll speak first. Then we'll move on to hear from Clare, who I'm sure for those of us in the UK is a famous name indeed. Clare served as Secretary of State in the UK at the time when DFID became an independent ministry. This was a key moment for the UK's development cooperation, and also when development aid in Britain became focused on poverty. She basically created the independent DFID, which is so important and which today many of us are struggling to safeguard and protect. And then we'll hear from Evelyn Herfkens, who also played a key role as Minister for Development Cooperation in the Netherlands during this period. And since during that time and since, she's served on a whole range of high-level boards, still very active in the development field. So they'll each speak for 10 minutes. And then we'll hear briefly from Richard Jolly, known to you all, I think, as one of our IDS Emeritus Fellows, ex-director of UNICEF and the Human Development Report in UNDP, and somebody who was very much part of the UN system, the development cooperation system, at the time that this book is talking about. So delighted to welcome you all. And without more ado, I'll hand over to Costas for our opening intervention.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Leach. I would like to thank IDS, Professor Leach, Professor Jolly, and their colleagues for organizing this launch. I'm very pleased and honored that IDS has taken this initiative. IDS is the preeminent institution that has provided leadership throughout the world for the last several decades on thinking and taking action against poverty. Today, we're facing an epidemic of proportions unheard of that is spreading in the the developing world in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere. So it is very important that we try to focus again on the kind of experience that the four ministers had during the stay in the early, about 20 years ago. I will say a few words about the origin of the book and then spend a little bit of time sharing some thoughts about the implications of what this experience says about today's challenges. The Utstein-four kept in touch after they finished their appointments, and they talked about having a reunion and even writing a book. But they were too busy to do either of those things. So a few years later, I had met them actually myself over the course of the last several years. But at the time, I wrote another book a couple of years ago called Aid, Trade and Development. I had devoted a few pages to their collaboration at the time. But it was not really didn't do a very good job in crediting their efforts, and I thought that something more needed to be done. So 2 years ago, I raised the question with Evelyn. I said, you know, how about writing a book about your experience? So she got in contact with Hilde Johnson and Clare Short and Heidemarie Wieczorek-Zeul. And yeah, sure enough, they said, yes, we'll go ahead and do this. And then Hilde actually invited us all to Norway, and we spent a few days discussing the book, the potential of the book. This was in July of 2018. And that created the basis, this conversation created the basis for the book. Then we had another meeting in Berlin that organized by Heidemarie in February of 2019 to review progress. And here we are a year later. I must say that this is their book. I mean, I put it together on their behalf, so to say. They have written extensively. They have had a lot of correspondence with major figures at the bank and the development business and the IMF and with each other. They wrote a lot. They spoke a lot. So there was and at the end of the day, they made a lot of contributions, commenting on the various parts of the book as it was being written. The book is also based on interviews that we had with a number of their colleagues, some of whom actually be listening, will be in the audience today. And then, of course, I had the benefit of using some of the archives, both at the national level and the international archives. Let me say a few words about the relevance of their experience for today's challenges. What we're witnessing a global pandemic. And in my view, global pandemic requires a global multilateral action to provide additional resources to poor countries to deal with the pandemic and its aftermath. We need a new initiative. We need a new conspiracy, if you wish, just like the ones that these ladies had 20 years ago, to deal with the problems that the developing world, the poor countries in particular, will be facing in the aftermath of this crisis. The developed world is busy doing its own thing, and although there are some preliminary steps that I think are going to be helpful. Today I read in the paper that Gavi is putting together something important in the form of funding for a vaccine. But I think the UF4 experience is important in the sense that it shows the benefits of collaboration by important countries, by important people. Let me just close my remarks by summarizing or making 5 points essentially about how to get together and organize a new initiative to help developing countries address the problems of eliminating poverty, especially in the context of the current pandemic. The first thing is, of course, the importance of leadership. The 4 Utstein ministers were strong, substantive, articulate, and they spoke with one voice. And that's very important. The second point is their willingness to promote global objectives, even if when these objectives were at variance with their narrow national interests. This is extremely important in the current environment. The third is that it helps when the leaders are representing important countries which have a background, experience, and a track record of multilateral cooperation. This was important at that time, and it is very important today as well. The fourth point is that collaboration is not glamorous. Collaboration is hard work, requires a willingness to submerge individual egos for the common good. And let me have a final thought to conserve some time for the other panelists. The final thought is that these characteristics of cooperation, collaboration, and willingness to submerge individual egos, studies show that women have a greater capacity of doing this than men. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a great start and a great introduction. So I'm going to move straight on to Clare Short to give us her perspective on the events at that time.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying the credit for this book really goes to Costas and Evelyn. We did meet up and share documents and views as Costas has described, but they put in the bulk of the work. Evelyn provided her archive. The rest of us were fully consulted and we did comments and some materials, but they should get the major credit. And I want to give them that credit. It would not have happened without them. Maybe we would have just kept talking about it. And then for myself and the strategy I pursued in the establishment of DFID and its way of working, and indeed, I think the strategy that we all shared when we came together, I want to particularly thank Richard Jolly. It's just so delightful that he's here. After I took responsibility for development in opposition, and after I was demoted from transport, to my great delight, maybe not the process, but the outcome, I began to read and consult widely, as you'd expect. And then I met Richard on a visit to New York. I think he was still at UNICEF, I'm not sure. And he said, look at this report from the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, Shaping the 21st Century. Have a look at that. It's a really important report, said Richard. So I duly did so. And then meeting, as you do in the UK system, the permanent secretary of your department to be, I met John Verica, and he'd been a member of that report. And I said, this is going to be the centerpiece of everything we do. So Richard was in there from the beginning too. And of course, that report took account of the lessons of the last 50 years, what had worked, what could be done, and argued for a much more united set of objectives, a collaborative effort to achieve much more, halving the proportion of people living in poverty, all children in school, measurable reductions in child and maternal mortality, progress on gender equality, access to reproductive health care. These were the international development targets, which DFID from the start was arranged around and was taken up with enormous enthusiasm by the staff. So there was very high morale and very high commitment, united commitment in the department to those ends, which makes you a more effective organisation. And all DFID's work was shaped and managed behind. And of course, they became and were the core of the Millennium Development Goals, which were a very important achievement in uniting the whole world behind a series of development objectives to mark the new millennium. I fear that the Sustainable Development Goals, as important as they are, aren't getting quite the same push behind them. We must try and achieve that. And that report also stressed the need to work in partnership with governments in developing countries, rather than coming in and hectoring them and telling them what's wrong and what they've got to do, because all the evidence is when governments want to make progress and come into a partnership, that's when you get sustainable advance. And the final point was that it's not just a question of distributing ODA, it's a question of all areas of policy. Trade, investment, tax, etc. So that was the strategy we picked up, first me and DFID, and then as we got together, those were the ideas really that united us. And the next point I want to make is that international development is littered with reports, exhortations, ringing phrases, initiatives. And that's where this conspiracy of implementation comes in. Instead of launching lots of new reports from all our countries and saying, you know, hand on heart, how much we want to help the poor and coming up with our initiatives, we were this conspiracy of implementation. Let's agree on some internationally agreed objectives and all get behind it and really push. And that sounds simple, but it's unusual. And of course, we're trying to push not just our own countries and departments, but the whole international development system to unite behind this combined effort. The second important point I wish to make is that there are too many actors in development. Donor countries, ever-growing numbers, NGOs proliferating, applying for funds, all the UN agencies competing with each other rather than combining in their effort as Kofi Annan wanted, development banks, philanthropists, academic bodies, private sector organizations now, of course, applying for development funds to be an implementer on the ground. And they all trip over each other to raise funds, to establish projects, to evaluate and measure results. And we were very clear that this is an ineffective way of working, and it pushes governments into constantly accounting for all these different actors, rather than getting on with improving the governance of their own country and being accountable to their own people. So one of our major aims was to coordinate on the ground and use the same mechanisms for accountability to have a bigger impact and lower the burden on countries of evaluations and meetings with ministers and all the rest of it. And then I want to say in addition that I remain a great believer in budgetary aid. It's gone way out of fashion. But if you can commit long-term funds with agreement with governments into their budgets, then the need for transparency and accountability in your own country means you have to work together with that government to get really good financial systems and transparent financial systems. And after a long-term partnership on building a health system or building an education system, you get a massively bigger impact, and the government is in the lead, but any improvements in financial management are permanently beneficial. And I still think it's a very good way of doing development if you can. And of course, it's almost disappeared. There's lots of talk about governance and improvements in governance, but that's a way to really deliver improvements in governance for real country systems. My third major point is that development is not just the distribution of ODA. Investment agreements, international tax policy, prices of drugs and vaccines, not recruiting health workers from developing countries. We brought that in, but I think it's gone when they're needed at home. And efforts to end and prevent conflict. This is all essential. I mean, for example, the Africa Conflict Prevention Pool that brought together the FCO, the intelligence agencies, the Ministry of Defence, Number 10, etc., was initiated by the Department for International Development. But one of the effects of that is that you're pushing other departments right across your government system. and they rather resent it often. They think, we thought, you know, ODA is about giving out a bit of charitable money. How come you're telling us what to do? So if you're going to shift the attention of the international system and your government system, there is some sort of conflict built into that effort. So the point of our collaboration, the 4 women ministers, was to take these policies into our own ministries and governments, and then into the World Bank, the IMF, the European Union, which was a poor player at that time. I think it has improved. The forms of debt relief, the collaboration on the ground, proper partnerships, respectful partnerships with developing countries, to make them the core of the development system right through the international system. So grouping together was no substitute for the tough work of turning around our own country's policies and performance, but it did, I think, very significantly increase our influence in the international system and in the World Bank, in the IMF, and so on. So in conclusion, there's a danger that the book refers to speeches and documents about what we were doing. And that is what books must do. I mean, they must refer to some, but it is the day-to-day push at all levels that is the real work. And people mustn't think that issuing speeches or publishing documents is a substitute for that grinding forward, and indeed enjoyable grinding forward. I think we made real progress, and of that we and the staff of our departments can be proud. In my case, I worked in an old-fashioned way with the department. That's where the skills are. Put that together with leadership and you can really get an advance rather than just issuing press releases. I fear that the move since then to individualized results-based management and all the bureaucratic burden that goes with it has been a regression. But perhaps, as Costas said, with COVID-19 and the need for international cooperation to contain the virus, not fully understood yet, but it will be with the risk of a second wave and so on. And indeed, as well, to seriously engage with the challenge of climate change, we might again look for better ways to collaborate internationally, and then some of the lessons contained in the book might prove useful for the future. Thank you.
That was fantastic. And I think those points you came to at the end are really crucial. And I think it would be very good if we were to come back to some of those future implications in discussion. But next, we're going to hear from another of the women about this conspiracy of implementation. What a great phrase that is. So, Evelyn.
Yeah, while Claire was laying out that agenda again, I thought, oh my God, it's so relevant today. All of these points are still acutely relevant. But indeed, we did make actual progress in the real world by implementing these issues. But I must also acknowledge that we were actually pretty lucky at the time. Around the turn of the century, the stars did align. Our own economies were in very good shape. So there was no political pressure, not that much, on our budget or on the way that we were spending the budget. At the time, there was also enlightened leadership in many of the international organizations. And the US was actually surprisingly helpful, first with the debt relief under the Clinton administration, and then even more surprisingly, George Bush came to the Monterey Finance for the Development Conference. He pledged money, and even more unique, he actually delivered billions of dollars for aid. So that was a very helpful thing. What we also were very lucky with is that there were tons of people who were really very motivated by the fact that we actually did this. So we had allies in civil society, in our own ministries, in ministries in developing countries, and international organizations where a lot of people were already thinking a long time, this is the agenda we must implement, and were empowered by us to indeed join that battle. But the most lucky we were, the fifth point, is that actually at the time, all across sub-Saharan Africa, governance was improving and economic policies were improving. So it was way easier at the time to respect ownership and work together. Now, the book documents that how we were working together, how we spoke with one voice, be it with different accents and definitely different tones, But we were able to achieve consensus, first on debt relief, and not just on debt relief, but also on a way to relieve that ensured that the monies that came available were actually invested in reducing poverty. We achieved consensus about how to make aid more effective, and Claire just laid out the whole agenda, what's important in doing that, partnership, ownership, etc. We got international consensus, which was later codified and much later again thrown out of the window, but at the time we got that international consensus. And what we also achieved was, at least within the European Union, that there finally was an agreement that there should be a deadline for when rich countries actually achieve that 0.7 of their national income to be spent on development cooperation. An agreement reached that we should be doing that in the early 70s, but we actually got within the EU agreement with a deadline. Now, what helped, what was this all did enable developing countries to make huge progress towards the Millennium Development Goals. There was huge progress, and what I like most about it is that actually the biggest progress, relatively speaking, was in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that we still can celebrate that, whatever bad the situation today. Let's not forget that every girl that went to school at the time, that otherwise wouldn't have, enormously improved not only her own life, but the life of her kids that are being born nowadays. And that every kid whose growth was not stunted because lack of nutrition has a better life today than otherwise would have been the case. Now, indeed, the situation now is way more challenging, and particularly now with COVID-19, which actually happened after the book was already published. And COVID-19, it's not for developing countries just a health issue. Their economies are being crushed. Remittances down, foreign investment down, tourism down, commodity prices down. It is a huge economic disaster, which means that for the first time since the Second World War, we'll see a huge increase in poverty. And actually for the first time, a serious decrease in the last 30 years. And according to the UN, that can lead to up of 500 million people more in poverty. So there is indeed the need of urgent action, and not just in the health sector, because we had the debate within Utstein at the time also, when all these separate diseases were, getting all this attention. But the real issue is the health systems, which are very fragile. And if you put all your attention and money in one disease, you actually undercut everything else. And it would be a disaster if now attention to COVID-19 would undercut the vaccination programs, the fight against malaria, TB, and HIV/AIDS. So we have to be sure that the whole of the health system is being supported, and not just that. But it is not just the health system, it is the economies as such. And the agenda is indeed very similar to what we achieved at the time. Debt relief, where the IMF World Bank spring meetings made a little bit of progress, but not enough yet. And it's going to be more of a challenge this time, because of a lot of the debt owed by developing countries is to China. And it will be hard to bring China aboard for such an international initiative. The second thing is indeed more and improved development finance for development. Now, each individual country, individual rich country, can easily increase its own budget and can easily unilaterally decide to make its aid more effective. But I think what the Utstein experience shows is the incredible importance of exercising peer pressure to get everybody on board to do the right thing. So international action is needed. Global pandemic needs global response. Once again shows what happens elsewhere impacts our lives. An outbreak anywhere is an outbreak everywhere. So it shows there is the need more than ever of global multilateral cooperation. It is going to be a challenge, because there is no United States to work with. I mean, let's not even waste time on that. So there is a huge challenge that Europe has to take a lead, has to learn how to reach out and work with emerging countries. And on Europe, actually, I was thinking, but there's no UK in Europe anymore. Because Clare, you know, the UK has been incredible, has shown incredible leadership. And DFID is, you know, the best outfit ever, the way you created it. That's not what it used to be, but still. So we're gonna miss the UK. But then I heard this morning that actually the UK government has taken a great initiative to get vaccinations affordable for everybody or available for everybody.
Well, it simply hosted that meeting. I mean,
It hosted.
but it only hosted it. Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever. It's still part of the group. So, okay, action is needed, but I've done my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Again, a great emphasis on global cooperation, something I'm sure we'll come back to in the Q&A. So turning now to Richard, who, as we've heard, was part of this era and indeed part of the genesis of this golden part of development cooperation. Richard, do you want to offer us some reflections on the significance of this book, what happened then and its implications?
Yes, I will. It's a great book, revealing, insightful, and at points funny. And I want to start with the reactions to 4 women working hard together, as we've heard from 2 of them right now. And in the development ministers meeting in the development committee, all the countries were represented by ministers of finance and central bank governors, all those economists. However, there were the 4 women representing the aid ministries. This is what happened. The Australian finance minister was not amused and announced he would not attend these meetings anymore as long as the women were around. Quote, indeed, we were so effective, said, I think, Hilde Johnson, that the Brazilian finance minister, while walking out of the meeting, sighed, I am all for gender equality, but this is too much. 4 out of 24. And then for those of you who know Larry Summers, Hilde Johnson recalls that Larry Summers, at that time the US Deputy Treasury Secretary, was so upset that walking out of the meeting, he told Hilde Johnson that we were mistaken if we thought the Development Committee was going to become the Socialist International, at which point Hilde Johnson clarified that she was not, she was actually a Christian Democrat. Okay, thank you, Claire, thank you, Hilde, thank you, Costas. I think the book, as I've waved it several times, is wonderful. And on the question of luck in the 1990s, you make a certain point, you make a good point about a lot of favorable things. Add in addition the fact that in most countries of the world, military spending was reduced by 1/4 to 1/3 once the Soviet Union, had collapsed. And that extra finance was very important. Tragically, by 1998 or so, it had started going up again. But for a lot of this period, there was a lot of extra money from that. I just wanted to say in relation to what I've written in my notes, forces for success, leadership, of course, and the book is full of it, clear objectives, and not only education for girls, but debt relief pushed hard and untying of aid. And then coalitions of comradeship, unity of goals and purpose, and with persistence sustained over a number of years. Okay, that's the positive. Then I thought I should just underline the forces for failure. The book identifies, and thank you, Costas, for going into this in the end of chapters and towards the end of the book. The identifies difficulties in the bank and the fund, even when, as with Cola, there was clear policy lead at the top. And the book talks about the culture and the staff of the World Bank being reluctant. Well, to culture and staff, I would add ideology. The neoliberal economic ideology was often trumping analysis, research and context, or even experience at the grassroots level. This is where work by research institutes, I'm making a little plug for IDS. This is where research in institutes and research by the UN itself and in other parts of the international world can help. So ideology, I think, needs to be very much emphasized as where there's a need for a shift. There's been some. And finally, interest and voting power from the most main industrial countries who have, of course, the disproportionate share of votes. I enjoyed the last chapter of the book, the section on what lessons are there for the SDGs. Thank you, very useful. And I think the questions we have there for the SDGs in relation to the lessons of the Utstein-four experience. Objectives. Well, I think the SDGs have provided them, although it's, as we all know, the MDGs were very precise. The SDGs are very broad. Personally, I think it was time to become broad, but it must be each country and at each town locally or each state must set the priorities within the broad 17 goals. It is sad that the world, as Clare and Evelyn have brought out, has been turning its back on the commitment to globalization and the coordinated global action, and indeed many of the agreements on what should count as aid going back. And UK is one of the worst of that, so much being used just for promoting our exports. Ideology. I've said we must move back from the discredited neoliberal orthodoxy, be it called austerity or structural adjustment. Now, the thing about that, I'm pleased to say, is that World Bank research has shown that the structural adjustment of the 1980s and 90s didn't work in the long run. It was a force against growth. That needs to be pushed by a new Utstein-four into policy and country by country policy of the bank. The stronger UN and more collaboration with the Bretton Woods institutions is the third thing that is needed. And finally, of course, and the whole lesson of the book, leadership. Where can we find a new Utstein-four, women or men, and it could be more than 4, but please, we need that sort of leadership. And that's what the last sentence of the book underlines so well. Thank you.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much. So a great set of presentations about a book that is clearly a must read for a lot of people. So I really would encourage you to take a look at it. But now we've got about 25 minutes or so for some open discussion. And what I'm going to do is to ask people to raise their questions either by putting them in the chat or sharing them on YouTube. And then my colleagues are going to be putting them in a Word document and I'm going to read them out. And we'll do them all in a batch. And then I will come back to each of our panelists at the end to pick out what they feel that they're well positioned to respond to. I think given the shortage of time, that's probably the best way to go. So while people are thinking of their questions, we've already got one comment in the chat, which I think I'm going to relay actually, because it's a very apt one, and it's from Florina Savage, who comments, I used to work for DFID in Kosovo during the time when Clare Short was heading it and beyond. I can confirm very strongly that the period under Clare's leadership was indeed the golden international development era, but not only. I was honoured to be part of a small corner under her remit. After her departure, and even before the political changes in the UK, the organisation changed. The focus on poverty shifted, and slowly but steadily the freedom of expression within DFID was reduced, in parallel with the global decline of democracy. The debates on aid effectiveness slowly died out, and DFID slowly subsumed under FCO leadership to lose voice almost completely. It was sad to see such an excellent organisation and mission lose sparkle. This is to confirm that leadership matters, and Clare was such an inspiring leader. Now, I mean, I relay that partly because I wanted Clare to hear it, and you might not look at the chat. And I'm sure that people working for their relevant ministries under any of these four women would have similar comments to make. And I think it tells us something about the importance of leadership, the importance of the culture within an organisation, and the way that that then can relate to the outside world. And I think one of the questions, so as people start to think of questions, I think it would be interesting both to reflect on things that went on then, but also what we might do now in an external world, which obviously looks very different. Yes, much less democratic, much more ideological in some different ways. New challenges, epidemics, climate change, which was only just coming onto the radar at that earlier time, and some very, very big challenges to confront. So I think it'd be good to think about the future, think about the kinds of organisation that we need and the role of development cooperation, but also to how we can look back to look forward. So please put your questions up. So I've got a first one here, which is mainly to Evelyn, but I think could be to anybody. What was the most difficult moment in this journey? So that's one. I might take some others if there are any others coming through at this point. Not so far. So perhaps we will go to Evelyn. Maybe you'd like to reflect on that, and actually perhaps also Clare as well. It would be good to hear from each of you. What was the most difficult moment at that time, if you can remember?
Yeah, I mean, it's 20 years ago, and looking back, I think there were no difficulties. I feel that everything was great and everything went well. But to be honest, of course, there were difficulties. And for me, it was lack of time. I mean, not only I was voted out of office 4 years later, which is a very short time if you want to change the world. Also, lack of time in terms, you can't be everywhere all the time. And looking back, one of the things that I think I maybe had the balance wrong, I went to each and every international meeting because I thought that's the arena where we have to battle to make things changing. And that in that process, I might have sort of neglected the relationship back home and the relationship with my staff and with, you know, my political party, my parliamentarians, et cetera, because here's the thing. One of the problems we have nowadays, if you talk about what should we do now, is we were able to do this also because in our own countries, there was a huge constituency for doing what we did, you know, for development cooperation, et cetera. There was a huge constituency. So that makes things way easier to do that battle. And I think we have lost that in the process. And maybe me neglecting that at the time and taking it for granted is one of the reasons we've been losing it. One of the things I always remember is that when this resolution passed at the United Nations of the 0.7, Tanzania, Nyerere, had an additional amendment to the resolution that every development cooperation budget should spend a certain percentage to make awareness of these global issues part of their policies, awareness at home. And one of the problems that I see today is that that awareness lacks. And if I may make one more point, Richard, I've been quoting you for the last 20 years on what you once said about the degree that UN objectives are being reached is directly related to the degree in which normal people outside of, the UN, outside of the development ministry, are aware of these objectives and thus ensure that their own politicians are made accountable for their contribution to achieving them. And by the way, that was the whole base of the Millennium Development Campaign that I later founded. But I think this lack of awareness, this lack of constituencies, I mean, in the Netherlands, they threw the 0.7 out of the window. Well, we had implemented that since more or less that resolution had passed, and nobody said anything.
Okay, excellent. Claire, would you like to recall your most difficult moment?
Thank you. We had a very, very, very hostile Foreign Office, tried to prevent the department being established, briefed against it in the early days, seriously trying to create a sense that I was a problem, the department was a problem. That was pretty nasty. And of course, the Trade Ministry was furious that we took trade competence and so on. So the internal Whitehall stuff was difficult. Also, the NGOs looked for money from the budget, and they got their favorite MP and they wanted to come and see me. And the move to budgetary aid they didn't like, because then you're putting the money straight into governments. So there was some kind of hostility and criticism from there too. What happened to us was the morale of the department, the effectiveness of a united organization with a deep, passionate commitment, as the Florentine, was it, said, becomes so effective that when Blair started traveling, he kept getting compliments to DFID, and we strengthened. But there was a time at the beginning when we were really under, being battered, and it could have gone wrong. And it was the effectiveness in reality that then strengthened the department and meant they wanted to take a part in it.
That's really, really interesting. So there's a question that's now come through, which is a bit more of a substantive question from an anonymous attendee who says, in Colombia, studies are showing that next year will be at poverty levels from 20 years ago. So it's the same, no movement, as it were. Do you think developing countries have more tools today to overcome economic and social crisis faster? What are the key tools that need to be used? So it might be, we'll see what else comes in the meantime, but don't know if any of you would like to pick up on that. So tools, I mean, have the tools changed? Are there different tools available?
But I think good development and good governance completely overlap. We know that reaching out to all people, fund transfers to the poor, educating poorer children, basic public health, these things aren't just morally desirable, they're more effective in holding a country together and enabling it to overcome crises.
Yeah.
But a lot of it has gone out of fashion.
Yeah.
So the tools are there, but they need to be re-enlivened and re-argued for, and to win the cause. And we need some countries to do it and then be seen to be successful, and then others would follow.
That's a very good point. Other comments on this one? Yeah.
Well, I think indeed that there is way more consensus today of what the good policies are in every sector. I mean, even the IMF now acknowledged that inequality is really bad for growth. And everybody agrees that we have to invest in primary system, in basic education, basic health, etc. And it's interesting, it comes from Colombia, because it reminds me, in the 70s, I was a civil servant in the Dutch Ministry for Development Cooperation, responsible for the aid to Colombia. And I had very difficult discussions with the planning bureau at the time, that we said, no, we're not going to give you equipment for your hospital for the elites in Bogota. We want our help to be, our aid to be spent basic health centers in rural areas. Now everybody agrees.
Yeah.
In Colombia too, one hopes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a question now about finance, and it says, for any speaker who wishes to answer, this is from Mary Kawa. She says, do you think development finance is under threat today as donor countries themselves go through a recession? What would be your advice now to low-income countries who are facing huge deficits and debt burden?
So that our advice at the time already was, please don't be so dependent on what we do.
Yeah.
You know, we already told them,
Yeah.
be aware of the fact that if you sort of improve your potential to export, it will bring you way more than we can ever give you without the lectures that come with it. So there are way more ways to do it. And we told them at the time. I mean, things as decent tax systems in these countries are issues that we raise time and time again. Also get more international cooperation to prevent that a lot of tax leaks away to rich countries.
Mm. Mm.
Let me say.
Oh, sorry, is that Richard?
No, it's all right.
This is
I think they aren't going to, in the face of the global pandemic and the poverty that's going to come.
Yeah,
Is coming already behind the lockdown policies across the whole world economy, locking down together. They won't cut the budgets, but they're using them more and more deviously, as Richard said.
yeah.
No longer just focused on poverty and building systems in the country, but trying to progress British trade and then you get misspending of aid. I think that is the real danger. And what should developing countries do? I think demonstrate effective use of the money for the benefit for public health, for the needs of poor people, you know, to hold the country together. And I think that's going to be really very testing.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me add a couple of things. Couple of things. First of all, let's not focus only on finance. The trade situation is going to be a disaster. Because at this point you have a lot of controls have been put up on the export side by developed countries, and the whole trade system has been completely undermined by the United States. So I think that the developing countries will have a serious problem in financing deficits and in actually getting the trade going again, and that's really a serious constraint. Not so much. I mean. And the developed countries have a lot of spending to do domestically, and I think that there's going to be neglect on the other side unless somebody picks up the ball and starts pushing it. That you need an initiative on this issue, otherwise poverty is going to increase phenomenally.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we've got a few questions coming in now, and I'm going to maybe take a few, and if you can reflect on those, and then we'll come back to everybody at the end. So this is one still on the poverty theme from Yun Siwei from Malaysia, who basically says, why is it so hard to end poverty? Or why does it take so long to end poverty? What do you think is the major hindrance, given that you're showing us some key tools to do it? And then there's another question from Noyanika Bagchi, which is more about governance and the context, I think. Who asks, how is it that people can work on agendas such as the SDGs and development when there is when there's a significant amount of animosity shown by the ruling parties in government against the people? Development is so important, it's so multifaceted, and it's an issue that many people feel deeply about. But I speak as an Indian, where there are many issues today regarding the highly Islamophobic policies that the government's pushing forth. How is it that proper development can take place in a situation like this? Can Western policies and ideas of aid and development be used in South Asia? So I think that's really a question about development and conditionality, or more broadly, what do we do now we're in an era where so many of the countries where development might be seeking to eradicate poverty is also running up against highly problematic governments of many kinds. So it would be very good to have your reflection on that point. I wonder if there are any others, because in a moment I'm going to go, we're running low on time. So if anybody wants to ask something quickly now, we've got time probably to add in another couple. Yep, so we've got one here from Tadashi Hirai, who says, what's your advice when views collide between donors and recipients for the way of using funds? So that might be local beneficiaries. I guess it might also be governments in those situations. So I think those are three interesting ones. Unless there's any others quickly coming in. No, I think we'll perhaps leave it there. So let's now perhaps go back in turn. Maybe Evelyn and then Claire and then Costas, just to pick up on any of those three that you'd like to, and then I'll come quickly back to Richard for a closing remark or two.
Well, I'll be very short because actually these questions, libraries have been written about, and I really don't know where to even start. But the answer of the first question is partly, of course, the second question.
Yeah.
There are developing countries where the elites don't care at all about their own poor. And that is a serious problem where we as outsiders can do very little about. It is the people of these countries themselves that have to demand accountability and demand better governance.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is that we rich countries have been doing a lot that contributes to that lack of accountability, including the way that we used to give aid was you are accountable to us donors instead of to your own people, first and foremost, which has been, you know, undermining accountability of governments in developing countries. I'm not sure I have much wise things to say now, much more. Claire, could you just come in now and
why is it so hard to reduce poverty? Actually, there has been considerable progress in reducing poverty. If you look at the global figures, that was the first question. But what there has also been is a big growth all over the world in inequality. So countries might be growing their economy and the absolute abject poverty figures might be going down, but the sense that the poor people making progress is much less because the share out of what has been achieved has been so bad. And that's everywhere, it's in every country. And I think, as Evelyn said before, there's a growing feeling about that inequality is a major issue, not just morally and it's unfair, but it makes capitalism not work. You know, the people who get all the money aren't spending it and the whole economies. So there's a chance here for a change, and we need to get that to be a united international opinion that pushes governments in new ways. We're not there yet, but I think we could achieve that. And Nyanika, yes, indeed, we've got some nasty governments. But I would say when the Millennium Development Goals were declared, some governments that weren't really that concerned about the poor suddenly felt they had to join in. It became an international focus, and we need to get that mood again, which in the back, on the back of the pandemic, we're not getting it yet, but I think it might come when they realize you can't save any of our countries unless we control the thing together. And then what to do when the country's views collide with the donors. I think the answer is to be stubborn, to pursue the goals you've really got, to say yes, yes, but to stick to the main point, especially if the government has a good objective and the donors not. So it depends a bit which, but you know, if governments don't want to do what the donors say doesn't happen.
But Claire, we had a huge advantage indeed of these agreed Millennium Development Goals.
Well,
so when we had a policy dialogue,
the SDGs now.
You know, you guys signed for this at the United Nations. So what are we doing together to achieve them? That was helpful. There was international consensus we could build on.
Yeah.
They're there, but they're not in the mood of the world. But if everyone started to say, this is it, you've all signed them, we've all got to do it. Yeah. It's not only the right thing, it's the only way to save capitalism. We might, and indeed to deal with the virus and address climate change. Yeah. We need to change that mood, and then it would push lots of governments that aren't doing the right thing in a new direction. That's what we need.
Okay, excellent. So I think those are quite good resounding last points actually, because we are going to run out of time. So going to turn now to Costas. Any comments on those points and any, as it were, last take-homes you'd like to offer?
The economic situation in countries, in the developing countries, is much better now than it used to be, except for the virus. The capacity to do things is there. The governmental structures have improved, so they're in a better position now. The international cooperation is much less than it used to be, and the focus should be on the international cooperation, because the governments in developing countries are in much better position than 20 years ago. But the international community is not where it used to be.
Okay, right. Thank you. So, Richard, any last concluding thoughts from you on the discussion you've heard and pointers for the future?
Well, I think it's been a great discussion. 3 final thoughts. It convinces me that leadership and straight talking makes a big difference, and we need to find that. Second point, don't be discouraged if your country is not taking the SDGs as seriously as possible. What about your town or your county or whatever? And anyone who sends me an email, I'll send them what Lewis Sussex is doing and what Bristol is doing, who's appointed a SDG ambassador. And finally, this is the day to buy the book, because it's 70%, it's at 70% the normal price if you buy it, I think, in the next 24 hours.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And I mean, a final word from me. We missed a couple of questions which came up. One was about China and cooperation, and another was came from someone who'd worked in Bangladesh, who both of which in different ways are talking about working in partnership with government, which was so much what you were advocating for at that time and is so important today. And it just strikes me that, I mean, yes, some things have changed, and as we've been hearing, now we're concerned not just about poverty, but critically about inequality. Climate change and environmental devastation have risen up the agenda. And I think we are in a world which is more beset by crises and shocks than at that time, whether they're economic, whether they're health, like the current pandemic, whether they're natural disasters, whether they're conflict. And of course, today, poverty is so much about living in a situation of protracted crisis. I think my moment of optimism at this point, one is to take from what we've heard today about really the importance of collaboration and of leadership and of building solidarities between countries at the global level, and actually between local government and national governments. I think there's really key points about accountability and accountability of governments to their citizens, and those points about global solidarity, which I think the Utstein-four kind of embodied and pushed so very clearly at a time when maybe it was a bit easier, but probably not entirely easy. And perhaps we should all be thinking about COVID-19 as an opportunity for, some people are using this phrase, building back better, or at least an opening that might now lead to some kind of transformation, really to get the values of the SDGs with their universality, not just about poverty in developing countries, but poverty and inequality and climate change and crisis is something that affects everybody everywhere, into hearts and minds, and back into development cooperation agencies who can actually not just push agendas, but engage in conspiracies of implementation to make them happen on the ground. So thank you all for an incredibly inspiring talk. Thank you, audience, for listening, and please now go ahead and buy the book in the next 24 hours. And I hope we can continue this conversation, because it couldn't be more important. So a big clap to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.